Have you ever noticed how, at times, your own mind seems to work against you? As if there were a constant noise, a cycle of thoughts that doesn't leave you alone, that holds you back, that tires you, even when everything around you is silent? It's as if something invisible is taking up space inside you, repeating doubts, fears, and memories that you didn't want to relive but can't stop it. And the more you try to control it, the more it seems to escape. You get distracted, you try to ignore it, you try to be strong, but deep down you know there's a struggle going on inside your mind, a silent battle where no one sees, no one hears, but you feel. And the most unsettling thing is to realize that many of these thoughts don't even seem like yours at all. They just show up, settle in, and begin to dominate. Now, what if I told you that there is a spiritual reason for this that you feel, something that most people have never been taught to see, something that has always been before the eyes, hidden in the scriptures, but that few have really understood? There is a key, a way of taking control of your mind that does not depend on your strength or your emotional capacity, because the truth is, God has never left you without direction. There is a path already revealed that teaches how to govern thoughts, how to silence internal voices, and how to align the mind with something much greater. But this path is not obvious. He is deep, spiritual, and often ignored. The Bible already stated this when it said, "And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Romans 12:2. And it also reveals a powerful secret, bringing every mind captive to the obedience of Christ. 2 Corinthians 10:5. This is not just advice, it is a spiritual strategy. There is a hidden code in these words, a way of living that completely changes the way the mind works. And when you understand that, everything changes. Today, you will begin to see that which has always been before you, but has never been explained in this way. And if you stay until the end, something inside you will start to reorganize in a way you may never have experienced before. And what you will discover from now on is not common. Each step of this journey reveals spiritual principles capable of reorganizing your mind, calming anxiety, and bringing clarity that many spend their entire lives seeking. You will understand how to identify thoughts that do not come from God, how to replace them with truth, and how to develop a steady mind aligned with heaven. Biblical stories will become living mirrors, showing that ordinary people learned to master the chaos within when they decided to listen to the right voice. As you continue, something begins to change inside, as if each word is finding exactly the place where you need it most. Thou shalt keep in peace him whose mind is set upon thee. Isaiah 26:3. And that's what's being activated here. If this message has already started to speak to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this can reach someone who is also in need of this direction today. There's something that completely changes the game when you start to realize not every thought that crosses your mind deserves to be accepted as truth. And maybe no one has ever taught you this clearly, because most of the time we grow up believing that everything we think is simply normal, when in reality there is a spiritual origin behind many of these thoughts. Jesus understood this like no one else. In a remarkable moment, Peter, someone close, someone who loved Jesus, begins to speak, trying to protect him from suffering. To human eyes, it seemed careful, it seemed logical, it even seemed like love. But Jesus looks beyond the appearance and responds directly, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not understand the things of God, but the things of men." Matthew 16:23. This reveals something profound. The same sentence can carry a human intention or a spiritual distortion, and only a mind aligned with God can discern the difference. That's where true mind control begins. It's not about silencing everything, but about filtering, about asking, where does this thing I'm thinking about right now come from? Does this thought bring me closer to God or push me away? Does it generate peace or restlessness? Does it build or destroy? Because there is the voice of God which brings direction, even when it corrects. There is the voice of the flesh which seeks immediate comfort, pride, and control. And there is also the voice of the enemy, which works in a subtle way, sowing doubts, fear, and confusion. The problem is that many times these voices are not identified. They arrive mixed, disguised as logic, memory, concern, and that is why the Bible warns, "The heart is deceitful above all things." Jeremiah 17:9. That is, not everything you feel or think can be followed blindly. There is a deeper level of discernment that needs to be activated. Perhaps now you begin to remember how many times you believed thoughts that paralyzed you, that made you doubt yourself, that stole your peace. Thoughts that seemed to be yours, but they were not in line with God's truth. Mind control starts here, recognizing that you are not obligated to accept everything that arises within you. There is authority available, there is clarity available, but it only manifests itself when you decide to observe, question, and choose. And something curious begins to happen when you develop this discernment. You stop reacting automatically and start responding spiritually. Your mind ceases to be a vulnerable field and begins to become a governed territory. If this message from God is speaking to you in a special way, it may not be a coincidence. Maybe that's exactly what you needed to hear today. And if something inside you has moved right now, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple word can mark the beginning of a quiet transformation that changes everything. There is a detail that almost no one notices in the process of controlling the mind. It is not about changing thoughts immediately, but about allowing something deeper to begin to transform them silently. True change does not happen on the surface. It begins in an invisible place where few pay attention. And it is exactly there that God works. The Bible says, "And be renewed in the spirit of your mind." Ephesians 4:23. This does not speak of a single event, but of an ongoing process, a daily construction, almost imperceptible, but extremely powerful. Because the mind is not transformed by momentary effort, but by constant exposure to the truth. Think of Paul, a man who was arrested, rejected, persecuted. Humanly, he had every reason to plunge into thoughts of despair, revolt, or giving up. But even inside a prison, he wrote about peace, joy, and hope. This is not natural. This is a result of a mind that has been trained, renewed, and aligned with something greater than the circumstances. This reveals a deep secret. The environment around you doesn't have to determine what happens inside you. There is a way of living where, even on difficult days, your mind remains firm, stable, protected. But this requires constancy, because renewal doesn't just happen when you feel like it, but especially when you decide to stay. Abide in the Word. Abide in the presence. Abide even when there is no emotion involved. It is in this place that something begins to change. Set your mind on the things that are above, and not on the things that are on the earth. Colossians 3:2. This is not just spiritual instruction, it is a practical strategy. What you feed in your mind grows. What you ignore weakens. And little by little, without realizing it, your thoughts begin to reflect what you have chosen to keep. Maybe you're waiting to feel something strong to believe that you're changing. But the truth is that the most powerful transformation is silent. It happens when you keep going, even without visible signs, when you insist, even without noticing immediate results. And this is where many give up, because they do not understand that God is working in the invisible before manifesting in the visible. But if you stay, something inevitably starts to happen. Your mind begins to react differently, your thoughts begin to align, and what once dominated you loses strength. If this word is awakening in you a sincere desire for change, then turn it into a simple prayer now. Write in the comments, "Speak, Lord, your servant hears," and leave your like on this video, because it can take that same transformation to someone who is still trapped inside their own mind. Now, there is an even deeper level of this control that few can reach, and it was revealed clearly in the most intense moment that Jesus faced in his humanity. The desert was not just a physical place. It was a spiritual setting where the mind was put to the test. After days without food, physically weakened, Jesus is confronted. And notice this: the enemy did not attack the body first, he attacked the mind. With suggestions, with ideas, with thoughts that seem to make sense in that context. If you are the Son of God, command that these stones be turned into bread. It was logical, it was possible, it was immediate. But Jesus did not respond with emotion. He did not respond with impulse. He responded with something that was already inside him. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. This reveals a principle that changes everything. What you carry inside your mind defines how you react when you are pressured. The enemy keeps trying. He distorts reality, tries to plant doubt, tries to induce quick decisions. And in each attempt, Jesus does the same thing. He does not argue, he does not negotiate, he does not get carried away. He answers with the word, with truth, with conviction. And here's the point that many overlook. Jesus didn't seek an answer right away. He already had this truth stored within him. This means that mind control does not begin at the moment of crisis. It starts earlier, in what you decide to store daily. Because when the moment comes, you don't react with what you want. You react with that which is full within you. He was tempted in all things, yet without sin. Hebrews 4:15. This shows that temptation is not the problem. The problem is how the mind responds to it. And the answer will always be based on what has been built before. Maybe today you are facing thoughts that seem too strong, too insistent, ideas that come at the right time to weaken you, to make you doubt, to lead you astray. But there is a difference between feeling and giving in, between listening and accepting. Jesus heard, but he did not accept. And that's exactly what starts to transform your mind. When you understand that you can listen to a thought without surrendering to it, that you can confront with truth, which you can replace with something bigger, and the more you fill yourself with the word, the more natural it becomes. The reaction changes, the posture changes, the mind is strengthened. If at any time you have felt this battle within you, do something simple now, almost as a silent mark of that decision. Write in the comments, "My mind belongs to God." Sometimes a simple statement carries a spiritual force that begins to align everything from within. There is a type of prison that does not make noise, but consumes energy all the time. It does not appear on the outside, but dominates on the inside. It's anxiety. And the most dangerous thing is that it is almost always born of a divided mind, pulled between now and a future that hasn't even happened yet, but that already seems too heavy to bear. You may know this feeling well. The body is present, but the mind is far away, thinking about what can go wrong, imagining scenarios, trying to anticipate problems that don't even exist yet. And the more you try to solve everything inside your head, the more tired you get. Because the mind never stops. This is exactly what Jesus spoke about with stunning clarity. Do not worry about tomorrow, because tomorrow will take care of itself. Matthew 6:34. This is not just a beautiful phrase, it is a profound spiritual direction. Jesus is teaching that anxiety is not only linked to what happens outside, but to the focus of the mind. An anxious mind is always in the future. A mind at peace is aligned with the now, trusting that God is already in control of what is yet to come. And that changes everything. Because when the mind learns to stay in the present, it stops carrying weights that were not meant for today. She begins to rest, not because everything is solved, but because she understands that she does not have to solve everything alone. Casting all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. 1 Peter 5:7. Notice this. Launching is not ignoring. It is not pretending that it does not exist. It is transferring. It's recognizing that there's something you don't have to carry, even if it seems too important to let go. But here's the point that many don't realize. It requires discipline, because the mind, by nature, tries to get back into control. It tries to anticipate, calculate, predict. And every time you allow it without realizing it, anxiety finds space. To control the mind at this level is to learn to bring it back, again and again and again, not with guilt, but with conscience. It's almost like holding the hand of a restless child and leading it back to the safe place. And little by little, something begins to happen. The noise decreases, the weight reduces, and a different peace begins to emerge. Not because everything has changed outside, but because something has lined up inside. Perhaps what you need most today is not immediate answers, but a repositioning of your mind, a new focus, a deeper trust. If you're here so far, it's no accident. There is something being dealt with within you as you listen to these words. And in the end, we're going to pray together, delivering the very thing that's been trying to steal your peace. Then it stays until the end, because that moment can mark a new beginning in the way you think, feel, and live before God. There is a point in the spiritual journey that almost no one talks about in depth. It's when the mind is no longer struggling, is tired. It is not a lack of faith. It is not spiritual weakness as many think. It's exhaustion. And that's exactly what happened to Elias. After experiencing one of the greatest miracles in history, facing false prophets and seeing God's power descend supernaturally, Elijah collapses unexpectedly. He runs away, isolates himself, and even says something that reveals the state of his mind. "Take my life now." 1 Kings 19:4. This is not just a phrase of discouragement. It is the reflection of a mind that has reached the limit. And maybe it touches deeper than it seems. Because there are times when you've felt that way too. Not for lack of God, but because of being overweight, excess of struggle, pressure, responsibility. The mind accumulates until one day she just can't take it anymore. The most powerful thing in this story is not the fall of Elijah. It's how God responds to that. God does not come with demands. It does not require immediate force. It does not bring a sermon. First, he takes care of the body. It gives rest. It gives food. Allow Elijah to breathe. This reveals a profound principle. A tired mind does not first need correction. It needs care. How many times have you tried to charge yourself more, be stronger, react faster, when in fact, what you needed was to stop, breathe, and allow God to restore you from within? After that, God calls Elijah to a meeting, and something surprising happens. A strong wind passes, then an earthquake, then fire, powerful manifestations. But God was not in any of them. And then comes the detail that changes everything, and after the fire, a still, small voice. 1 Kings 19:12. It is in this voice that God speaks. This reveals that a depleted mind is not restored in noise, but in silence, not in pressure, but in presence. And many cannot hear this voice because they continue to try to solve everything by force, by noise, by haste. Mind control is also about recognizing when you need to stop, when you need to disconnect from excess and reconnect with God. It's understanding that even the strongest go through moments like this, but they do not abide in them when they allow God to restore them. And maybe at this moment, God is not expecting you to fight anymore, but let you listen, that you slow down. May you allow that soft voice to reach exactly where you are most tired. If this part spoke directly to what you have been experiencing, turn it into a simple gesture now. Declare in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings," and leave your like, because this message can reach someone who is also on the edge and needs to find the same care that comes from God. If there's one thing that can completely change the way you live, it's understanding that your mind doesn't have to be an uncontrolled place, because in practice, many thoughts come in, but few should remain. And this is exactly where one of the most powerful and forgotten teachings begins: learning to filter. Not everything that comes to you deserves space within you. Most people don't realize it, but they treat all thoughts as if they were the same. A negative thought arrives, and it is accepted. A question arises, and it is already starting to grow. A bad memory appears, and gains strength. And so, without realizing it, the mind is occupied by what should never have been. God's word reveals a clear, direct, and extremely practical criterion. Whatever is true, whatever is honest, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, think on this. Philippians 4:8. This is not just a suggestion, it is a spiritual filter. Notice the depth of this. Before you allow a thought to linger, you can ask, is this true, or is it just fear? Is this pure, or is it contaminated by insecurity? Does it build or destroy? Does it bring me closer to God, or push me away? And when you start doing this kind of filter, something changes immediately. You stop being a hostage of what appears and become the guardian of what remains. Because the mind is not a neutral place, it is a terrain, and everything that is planted there grows. Sooner or later, that is why the Bible warns so strongly. Above all things that must be guarded, guard your heart. Proverbs 4:23. Guarding is not only about protecting from what comes from outside, but also about deciding what stays inside. Perhaps today you are dealing with thoughts that repeat themselves, that insist, that seem difficult to control. But the secret is not to fight all of them at the same time. It's in choosing which ones you feed, because a thought that is not fed loses strength. A thought that does not find space weakens, and little by little, what he once dominated begins to disappear. This is a conscious process, intentional, spiritual. And when you practice this daily, your mind starts to become a different environment. Lighter, clearer, more in line with the truth. If this message has already started to touch something inside you, don't ignore it. Perhaps this is one of those moments when God is speaking directly to your heart, and you can turn that into action now. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because then this same word can reach other people who also need to learn to protect their own mind and live this transformation. There is something that sustains the mind when everything around seems unstable. It is not emotional strength. It is not life experience. It is not absolute control of circumstances. It is faith, and not as a distant concept, but as a real, firm anchor, capable of preventing the mind from being carried away by fear. Pedro lived this intensely. In the midst of a storm, seeing Jesus walk on the water, he makes a decision that defies all logic: to get out of the boat. While his eyes were fixed on Jesus, something supernatural was happening. He walked on what would naturally sink him. This reveals a powerful principle. When the mind is aligned with Christ, it stands even in the impossible. But the text shows the breaking point. But when he felt the strong wind, he was afraid. Matthew 14:30. What has changed is not the scenario. The wind was already there, the waves already existed. What has changed is the focus of the mind. The moment Peter takes his eyes off Jesus and starts to observe the force of the wind, his mind disconnects from faith and connects to fear, and immediately the body responds to what the mind has come to believe. It begins to sink. This is more current than it seems. How many times have you started well, confident, believing? But at some point, did anything change? A problem arose, news arrived, a memory came back, and suddenly his mind was taken by insecurity. Faith works as a point of fixation. She doesn't ignore reality, but chooses where to put her focus. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Hebrews 11:1. That is, faith sustains the mind, not by what is visible, but by what is eternal. And here's the secret. The mind will always cling to something. Either it is anchored in faith, or it is dispersed in fear. There is no stable middle ground. To control the mind at this level is to choose daily where you fix your inner eyes. It's noticing when the focus is being stolen and bringing it back, not with guilt, but with conscience. It is understanding that the wind may even remain strong, but he doesn't have to determine what happens inside you. And even as Peter began to sink, there is a powerful detail. Jesus was there. This shows that even when the mind falters, there is still help available. Maybe today you are in the middle of an inner storm. Racing thoughts, unstable emotions, doubts arising. But there is an anchor available to you right now, and it does not depend on the absence of problems. It depends on the direction of your focus. If while you were listening to this, someone came to your heart, someone who is also facing a storm, don't ignore it. Write that person's name in the comments. Let's form a chain of faith, presenting each name before God, believing that the same peace that begins here can also reach her life. There is something that many people deeply desire, but few can truly experience, to hear God's voice clearly. And the reason is not because God does not speak, it is because the mind is too noisy to perceive. We live in a constant stream of thoughts, worries, memories, and distractions. It's as if the mind never shuts down. Even when the body stops, inside everything continues to accelerate, and in this state, the voice of God, which is subtle, almost imperceptible, ends up being muffled. The Bible carries a simple but extremely profound instruction. Be still and know that I am God. Psalm 46:10. Quieting down is not just stopping physically, it is silencing the interior. It is to slow down thoughts. It is to reduce the noise that prevents you from perceiving what is already being said, because God does not compete with noise. He speaks in the secret, in the intimate, in the silence. Jesus made this clear when he said, "My sheep hear my voice," John 10:27. This means that there is a spiritual capacity within you to recognize that voice. But this sensitivity needs to be cultivated. And here's a point that changes everything. Discerning God's voice is not an event. It's a relationship. The closer you get, the more you recognize. The more you silence, the more you notice. Maybe you're expecting something great, a clear answer, an obvious direction, but God often speaks simply. A thought that brings peace, a smooth steering, a nuisance that takes you away from something wrong, a clarity that arises without explanation. But to realize this, the mind needs to be available. And that takes practice. It is choosing, even if for a few minutes, to disconnect from the excess. It's learning to be silent without having to fill everything with distractions. It's allowing your mind to slow down enough for something deeper to begin to emerge. And at first, it may seem strange. It may seem like nothing is happening. But little by little, you start to notice subtle differences, a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a direction that does not come from logic, but from conviction. Quiet security. Controlling the mind is also this, creating space for God to speak, because a mind too busy with the world loses sensitivity to the spiritual. But a quiet mind begins to discern that which has always been present. And when you learn to recognize that voice, everything changes. Your decisions change. Their reactions change. Their way of living changes. Nothing happens by chance. If you've made it this far, there's a reason. Continue to the end, because what comes next can further open up your perception and bring you to a level of peace and clarity that you may never have experienced before. There is a silent question that many minds carry without even realizing it. Why am I here? And when that answer is not clear, the mind begins to wander. She gets lost in comparisons, gets distracted by small things, wears herself out trying to find meaning in everything. But he never finds real rest. A mind without purpose is easily overwhelmed by noise. Any opinion shakes, any difficulty disorients, any delay seems like a failure. But when the mind finds purpose, something aligns. Not because everything is easy, but because everything makes sense. Jeremiah lived this in a profound way. Even before he was born, God had already established something about his life. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you came out of the womb, I sanctified you. To the nations I have made you a prophet. Jeremiah 1:5. This completely changes the way we think, because it reveals that life does not begin by chance. It begins with purpose. And when the mind understands this, it stops comparing itself. Stop looking the other way, trying to measure your worth by the lives of others, because there is an inner consciousness. There is a specific path, a single direction, something that has been prepared. Many of the mental conflicts you face today may not be connected to what's going on outside, but to the lack of clarity within. When the mind does not understand where it is going, any path seems wrong. Any choice generates doubt. Any weight generates anxiety. But the word reveals something that brings firmness. Many are the plans in the heart of man, but the purpose of the Lord shall prevail. Proverbs 19:21. That is, it is not about trying to control everything. It is about aligning with what has already been established by God. And here's the deeper point. Purpose isn't just something you do. It's something that transforms the way you think. It organizes the mind. He directs decisions. It filters out what matters and what doesn't. When the mind is connected to purpose, it doesn't get lost in constant distractions. It does not wear itself out with empty comparisons. She begins to walk more safely, even when she still doesn't see everything clearly. And maybe you don't have all the answers right now. Perhaps there are doubts, paths that are still undefined, questions without a solution. But there is something that can start today: alignment. Because when you start looking for purpose in God, your mind stops running in circles and begins to follow a direction, even if it's one step at a time, even if it is still silent, even if it still doesn't make complete sense. Something inside you begins to organize. And this internal organization changes everything around you, even before any visible results appear. There is a type of thinking that is not born in the present. It comes from wounds from the past, situations that marked, words that remained, moments that were not resolved. And even though time has passed, the mind continues to carry these marks, as if it were still living it. Maybe you've already realized this. Certain thoughts don't come out of nowhere. They are activated by something that has already hurt, an old rejection, a disappointment, a loss. And without realizing it, the mind begins to interpret everything from that pain. It distorts, exaggerates, protects, but it also imprisons. That's why mind control isn't just about dealing with what you think today. It is allowing God to heal that which still influences your thoughts. The Bible reveals something profound about the human heart. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Psalm 147:3. This shows that God does not ignore pain. He treats. He enters the wounded place and begins a process of restoration that reaches even the way of thinking. David understood this like few others. He went through rejection, persecution, betrayals, Humanly, he had every reason to develop a mind full of fear, distrust, and bitterness. But what he did was different. He spoke with his own soul. "Why art thou cast down, O my soul? Hope in God." Psalm 42:11. Notice this. David did not accept any thought that arose. He confronted, he answered truthfully. Even though he felt pain, he declared something greater than what he was experiencing. This is real transformation. Because wounded thoughts need constant truths. It is not something that changes all at once, but something that is being rebuilt little by little. Each time you replace a lie with a truth, something inside you begins to line up. Perhaps your mind has learned over time to expect the worst, to be suspicious, to protect yourself from everything. But there is a new way of thinking being built now. A way that does not deny the past, but that does not allow it to continue governing the present. And this process requires a decision. It requires you to notice when a thought comes from a wound and choose not to feed it. It requires you to bring to mind what God says, even when emotion tries to speak louder. And little by little, what once hurt begins to lose strength. What he once dominated is beginning to be replaced. And the mind begins to experience something new: freedom. If this word has found something within you, it may not be by chance. Perhaps it is exactly the point that God is touching today. And if this made sense in your heart, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Sometimes a simple statement makes room for a healing that starts from the inside out. There is a silent, almost imperceptible moment when the mind is simply lost. It doesn't happen all at once. It's gradually. Small distractions, seemingly simple decisions, thoughts that move away from the truth. And when you realize it, you are no longer in the same place as before. This is exactly what happened to the prodigal son. He didn't just leave home physically. His mind had already disconnected before. He began to believe that there was something better away from his father's presence, that he could live on his own, make his own decisions, follow his own paths. And for a while, it all seemed to work. But there is something that always happens when the mind turns away from God. It begins to get confused. What once seemed right loses its meaning. What once seemed like freedom turns into emptiness. Until a decisive moment arrives, a moment that changes everything. The Bible says, "And when he came to himself, he said," Luke 15:17. This is profound. Before returning home, he came to himself. His mind awoke. He realized where he was, what he had lost, and especially who he really was. This is the first step of reconnection, awareness, because while the mind is distracted, lost, busy with everything around, it doesn't realize how far it has strayed. But when this awakening happens, something changes inside. It's not just emotion, it is clarity, and maybe that's exactly the moment you're living right now. A perception emerging, a feeling that something needs to change, that there is more than what you have experienced so far. And the answer is simpler than it seems, but it requires decision. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. James 4:8. Notice this, God is not far away. He didn't walk away. The reconnection begins when the mind decides to return. When you take a step toward him, even if it's small, even if it's silent, he answers. Controlling the mind also goes through this. It's not just correcting thoughts, it's repositioning the heart. It is to leave the place where you got lost and return to the place where there is direction, peace, and identity. And no matter how much time has passed, no matter how far you think you've drifted away, the way back is still open. It always has been. The prodigal son was still far away when his father saw him. This means that even before it arrived completely, it was already expected. He was already loved. It was already accepted. And when the mind understands this, the weight begins to fall. Guilt loses strength. Fear decreases, and a new beginning becomes possible. If you are here, it is not by chance. There is a movement going on within you right now, and I want to tell you something very clearly. Continue. Don't stop here, because what comes next can further deepen this transformation and bring you to a level of clarity and peace that you may never have experienced before. There is a silent difference between what you see and what is actually happening. And that's exactly where many minds get lost, because those who live only by what their eyes see will almost always be dominated by fear. But those who learn to see with spiritual discernment begin to perceive a reality that is not visible. But it is much more powerful. Elisha lived this clearly. At one point, he and his servant were surrounded by an enemy army. The situation in human eyes was impossible. There was no way out. There was no escape. And the servant, when he saw this, went into despair. His mind reacted to what was in front of his eyes. Fear, panic, confusion. But Elisha replied in a completely different way. Do not be afraid, for there are more who are with us than those who are with them. 2 Kings 6:16. Think about it for a moment. How can anyone look at such a threatening situation and yet remain at peace? The answer lies in the way he saw it. Elisha did not deny the problem, he simply saw beyond it. And then he prays, asking God to open the eyes of his servant. And at that moment, something extraordinary happens. The servant begins to see what was previously hidden. Horses and chariots of fire all around, a spiritual protection that has always been there, but that he couldn't understand. This reveals a profound principle about the mind. What you see is not all there is. Often, anxiety, fear, and insecurity arise because the mind is interpreting everything only by the natural. But the Word says, the natural man does not understand the things of the Spirit of God. 1 Corinthians 2:14. In other words, there is a way of thinking that limits, and there is a way of thinking that reveals. To control the mind at this level is to learn not to react only to what appears. It is to develop spiritual sensitivity to perceive what God is doing, even when it is not visible. Maybe today you are looking at a situation and everything seems against you. The circumstances do not help. The answers do not appear. The scenario seems closed. But what if there's something you're not seeing yet? And if God is already acting, preparing, protecting, and the only thing that needs to change is how you interpret what's going on. When the mind aligns with faith, it begins to see differently. Fear loses strength, confidence grows, and peace begins to emerge even before change happens. If this word has touched you in any way, maybe it's because God is showing you that there's more to it than meets the eye. And if you recognize that He has been good, even in the details you didn't notice, write in the comments, Amen. Sometimes a simple statement opens your eyes to that which has always been there. There is a place where the mind finally stops fighting, not because all the problems disappeared, but because something stronger began to sustain everything inside. This place is not physical, it is spiritual. It is the presence of God. Many people spend their lives trying to find rest in external things. They try to solve everything, control everything, understand everything, but even when they manage to organize some areas, the mind remains restless. Something is always missing. There is always an emptiness, a tension, a concern that insists on remaining, and it is because the mind was not created to find stability in circumstances. It was created to find stability in presence. Moses understood this in a way that few did. At a decisive moment, God offers to send an angel to guide the people, ensuring protection and direction. For many, this would be enough. But Moses answers in a surprising way. He did not want to move forward without the presence of God. And then God declares, "My presence will go with thee, and I will give thee rest." Exodus 33:14. Notice this carefully. Rest does not come from the absence of problems. It comes from the presence of God. This completely changes the way we see life, because while the mind is disconnected from that presence, it tries to stand on its own, and this generates fatigue, overload, confusion. But when she reconnects, something changes, not necessarily outside, but deep inside. In your presence there is a fullness of joy. Psalm 16:11. It is not a momentary joy, it is not something superficial, it is plenitude, it is something complete, which fills spaces that nothing else can reach. And maybe that's exactly what you've been looking for without realizing it. No more answers, no more control, no more explanations, but rest. God's presence reorganizes the mind. It calms racing thoughts, brings clarity where there was confusion, strengthens where there was weakness. And this does not happen by effort. It happens by proximity. The closer you get, the more your mind finds balance. The longer you stay, the more the interior aligns. And what once seemed heavy is starting to lose strength. But there is a decision involved. Moses chose not to continue without this presence. And this choice is daily. It's deciding that above all else, you need to be connected with God. Because when the mind moves away from that source, it is easily lost. But when she returns, she finds what she has always been looking for. And maybe, at this moment, God is calling you to just that. Not to do more, not to run more, but to get closer. This word is not for everyone. If you are here, it is because there is something being revealed to your heart right now. Continue until the end, because what is yet to be released can further deepen this connection and take you to a level of peace that you have not yet experienced. There is a silent mistake that prevents many people from experiencing a truly transformed mind. The idea that a single experience is enough to change everything. A strong moment, an intense prayer, an emotional decision, and then the expectation that from then on, everything will be different forever. But the transformation of the mind does not happen in an isolated instant. It happens constantly. God made this clear from the wilderness when the people of Israel depended on manna. It wasn't something accumulated. It wasn't something saved for several days. The instruction was straightforward. The people shall go out and reap daily the portion for each day. Exodus 16:4. This wasn't just about physical food. It was a spiritual principle. Each day has its own need, and so does the mind. There is no point in trying to live today with what you received yesterday. Yesterday's strength does not completely sustain today. Yesterday's clarity does not solve all the doubts of today. There is a daily dependence that needs to be recognized, and this is exactly where many get lost, because they start well, but they don't continue. They receive a word, they feel something strong, they have a moment of connection, but then let it cool. And little by little, the mind returns to the same patterns, the same cycles, the same confusions. Jesus reinforced this in a direct way. Take up your cross daily. Luke 9:23. Every day. This reveals that mind control is not an event. It's a practice, a decision renewed daily. Even when there is no emotion, even when it feels repetitive, even when no one is watching, because it is in this place of constancy that something profound begins to be built. The mind is being trained, thoughts are aligned, spiritual sensitivity is increasing, and over time, what once required effort begins to become natural. Maybe you felt it. Days when everything seemed lighter, clearer, more connected, and other days when the mind seemed heavy, confused, distant. The difference is often not in what happened outside, but in what was fed inside. Spiritual discipline is not about rigidity. It's about constant relationship. It's about coming back every day, even if only for a few minutes. It's about exposing yourself again to the presence, to the word, to the truth. And little by little, without realizing it, your mind begins to change its pattern. She stops reacting impulsively and begins to respond with poise. It stops getting lost easily and begins to stand firm. Because what is daily becomes solid. And when that foundation is built, it doesn't matter so much what happens around you. There is something inside you that remains stable, sustained, aligned. A mind that no longer depends on isolated moments, but which has been transformed by a continuous and profound process. There is something that can completely change the state of your mind in the midst of fear. What you decide to believe. Because fear does not arise only from circumstances. It grows when the mind loses its link with what God has already promised. And it is exactly here that many are weakened. Not because God didn't speak, but because the mind became disconnected from the promise. He begins to look only at the scenario, at the time that is passing, at what has not yet happened. And little by little, fear finds space. Abraham faced this intensely. God made a promise that humanly seemed impossible. Time passed, the body aged, the evidence was contrary. Everything around said it wouldn't happen, but the Bible reveals something extraordinary. Who in hope believed against hope. Romans 4:18. This means that Abraham chose to believe even when there were no visible reasons for it. His mind didn't stick to what he saw. She stood on what God said. And here's the turning point. God's promise doesn't depend on circumstances to be fulfilled, but his mind depends on the promise to stand firm. When you hold on to what God has spoken, something begins to change within you. Fear loses strength, anxiety decreases, and even though the scenario has not yet changed, there is a security that sustains it. Because the promise creates a new kind of thinking. It replaces doubt with conviction. It rearranges how you interpret what's going on. What once seemed impossible is beginning to be seen as something in process. Not a single promise failed of all the good words of the Lord. Joshua 21:45. This is not just a statement, it's a base. A solid foundation on which the mind can rest. Maybe today you are facing situations that seem uncertain, time-consuming, difficult to understand. Thoughts trying to convince you that it won't work, that it won't happen, that time has passed. But there is a choice before you now. Feeding fear or hold fast to the promise. Because what you decide to repeat inside your mind begins to shape what you feel, what you believe, and consequently, what you live. And when the promise becomes stronger than the scenario, something stabilizes within you. The mind stops oscillating. She finds a fixed point. If that word has rekindled something within you, maybe it's time to allow it to reach other people as well. There are many who are stuck in fear right now, needing exactly that direction. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel and activating the bell, you become part of something bigger, helping this message to get where it needs to go. There is a state of mind that seems impossible to reverse. When thoughts have been broken, when hope has been eroded, when everything inside seems in ruins, it's not something that happened overnight. It was gradually. Small falls, accumulated disappointments, repeated frustrations, until suddenly the mind no longer believes as before. And maybe this is the reality of many people who continue to follow on the outside. But inside they have already given up on some things. They do not speak, they do not demonstrate, but they carry a silent feeling that something has been lost. It was exactly this scenario that Nehemiah found. Jerusalem was destroyed, the fallen walls, the burned doors, everything exposed, vulnerable. And when he sees that, he doesn't ignore it. He feels, he cries, he recognizes the real state of the situation. This reveals something important. Reconstruction begins when you stop pretending that everything is fine and face what needs to be restored. But Nehemiah was not just in pain. He stands up with a decision. Come, therefore, and let us rebuild the wall. Nehemiah 2:17. This phrase carries something powerful. Even in the face of ruins, there is still the possibility of reconstruction. And this also applies to your mind. Thoughts can be reconstructed. That which has been shaken can be restored. That which has lost strength can be lifted again. But this does not happen instantly. It happens process by process, stone by stone. Nehemiah didn't rebuild everything in a single day. It was a continuous work, facing opposition, fatigue, external challenges. And yet he continued. In the same way, the reconstruction of the mind requires constancy. It requires you to start, even if it's small. It requires you not to give up when you seem slow. Because each aligned thought is a stone being placed in the right place. And there's something even deeper. You don't rebuild on your own. And may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace. Romans 15:13. This means that the source of reconstruction is not in your strength. It is in God. It is He who restores that which seems lost. It is He who restores the ability to believe. It is He who brings back the peace that seemed distant. Maybe today your mind is tired, fragmented, full of areas that need reconstruction. But that doesn't mean it's over. It just means that there is a process beginning. And just as the walls have been raised again, so can your mind be restored. Stronger, firmer, more protected than before. It all starts with a silent decision to start over, even in the midst of the ruins. There is a war that takes place within the mind before any external battle manifests. And the most impressive thing is that many of these wars are not won with effort, strategy, or force, but with delivery. Jehoshaphat faced a scenario that humanly was impossible to overcome. A great army was coming against him. There was no advantage. There was no plan enough. There was no guarantee of victory. And in the face of that, his first reaction was not to run, nor to fight. He went to seek God. That changes everything. Because while the mind tries to take control of everything, it overloads itself. It tries to calculate, predict, solve, but there comes a point when it just can't do it anymore. And that's exactly where many despair. But Jehoshaphat did the opposite. He acknowledged that he had no control. He gathered the people together and declared total dependence on God. And then came an answer that breaks all human logic. In this battle, you will not have to fight. 2 Chronicles 20:15. Think about it. A war, where victory would not come from struggle. This reveals a profound spiritual principle. There are battles that are not won by force, but by trust. And here's the central point for the mind. As you try to control everything, anxiety grows. But when you surrender control to God, the mind begins to rest. Jehoshaphat did not stand still for lack of action. He acted spiritually. He loved it. He trusted. He placed his heart and mind in the right place. And while he was doing that, God was working where he couldn't reach. And the result was clear: complete victory without direct confrontation. In all these things we are more than conquerors. Romans 8:37. That doesn't mean the absence of battle. It means the presence of God in the midst of it. Maybe today you are facing an internal war. Thoughts that insist, situations that seem bigger than you, a feeling that you need to solve everything yourself. But there is an invitation being made now. Let go of control. Because the mind that tries to dominate everything is exhausted. But the mind that trusts finds peace even before victory appears. This is not passivity. It is spiritual positioning. It's understanding that there are things you do, and there are things that only God can do. And when you learn that difference, something changes profoundly. The pressure decreases, fear loses ground, and a security begins to emerge, even without complete explanations. If this message is confirming something within you, it may be time to declare it in faith. Write in the comments, God takes care of me. Sometimes a simple statement repositions the mind and strengthens the heart to keep going. There is a deeper level of transformation of the mind that happens when you stop looking only at yourself and begins to carry others in prayer. Because while the mind is centered only on its own pains, problems and worries, it tends to close itself, to overload itself, to spin in repetitive cycles. But when she turns to intercede, something begins to expand. Intercession takes the weight off the self and connects the mind to God's purpose. Daniel lived this impressively. Even under threat, even though he knew he could be thrown into the lion's den, he did not change his practice. 3 times in the day, he knelt down and prayed. Daniel 6:10. This wasn't just discipline, it was alignment. His mind was not ruled by fear, but by constant connection with God. And here's what many don't realize. When you pray for others, your mind is also healed in the process, because intercession changes the focus. It takes you off center and puts God in control. It broadens your vision, strengthens your faith, and brings a sense of purpose that rearranges everything from within. What once seemed heavy begins to lose strength when you position yourself as someone who prays, who cries out, who puts yourself in the gap. The Bible reveals something strong. I sought out from among them a man who was in the gap. Ezekiel 22:30. This shows that there is a calling, an invitation for people who decide to take a spiritual stand, not only for themselves but for others. And when you accept that calling, your mind shifts. It is no longer just a personal battlefield and becomes an instrument in the hands of God. Maybe today you came here thinking only about your own struggles, but now something is starting to expand. People come to your mind, situations arise, names appear. This is not random. Because a mind aligned with God begins to feel what He wants to do, begins to realize where it needs to intercede, begins to move beyond itself. And in that movement, something powerful happens. You strengthen yourself while strengthening others. You find peace while praying for someone. You line up as you cry out. Intercession is not just a spiritual act, it is a path of transformation of the mind. And maybe that's the next step for you. Get out of the inner cycle and start positioning yourself spiritually for what is beyond you. What you will hear now may be deeper than anything so far. There is a level of understanding and connection that is yet to be revealed, and it may be just what you need at this time. Stay until the end, because there is something being prepared to reach you in an even more intense way. There is something that completely changes the way you deal with your thoughts, understanding that you were not created to be dominated by them. Most people live as if they were at the mercy of their own mind, accepting everything that arises, reacting automatically, being carried away by thoughts that often weaken, confuse, and paralyze. But that was never God's plan. The mind was not created to be a place of oppression. It was created to be a place of government, aligned with the spiritual authority that comes from God. And when this is not understood, wrong thoughts are no longer questioned and are accepted as truth. Jesus clearly demonstrated this authority. When he encountered evil spirits, he did not negotiate, he did not argue, he did not try to understand too much. He simply confronted and expelled. There was a firm stance, a certainty of authority, a clarity of who he was, and the power he carried. And this reveals something profound. There are thoughts that should not be analyzed, must be confronted. Thoughts of constant accusation, excessive fear, confusion, deep discouragement. Many times they don't need explanation. They need spiritual resistance. Because when you try to negotiate with what weakens you, you make room for it to remain. The Word makes this clear. Submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. James 4:7. There is an order here. First, alignment with God, then resistance, and then the consequence. What once seemed strong loses strength and retreats. It changes the way you look at your mind. You stop being passive and become active. You start to notice when a thought is not aligned with God. And instead of accepting it, you take a stand. You reject, you replace, you confront the truth. Behold, I give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions. Luke 10:19. This is not just symbolic, it is spiritual. There is authority available to you, but it only manifests itself when you decide to use it. Maybe for a long time you have become accustomed to thoughts that limit you. Maybe you've learned to live with them, to accept them as part of who you are. But from the moment you understand your authority, this begins to change. Because a mind aligned with God does not negotiate with that which weakens it. She takes a firm stand. It recognizes what comes from God and rejects what does not come. And the more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. The mind is strengthened, clarity increases, and what was once dominant begins to lose space. This is a level of control that does not come from human strength. It comes from the spiritual awareness of who you are in God. There is a moment when everything changes, not because the world around you has changed, but because something inside has been completely transformed. And when that happens, the way of seeing life is never the same again. Paul is living proof of this. Before, his mind was totally convinced that he was doing the right thing. He persecuted, judged, fought, believing that he was serving God. But in fact, his mind was misaligned, stuck in a limited vision based only on what he understood as truth. Until a date happens. On the way, something breaks that internal structure. It wasn't just a change in behavior. It was a transformation of perception. From that moment on, everything he saw, thought, and believed in began to be redefined. And then God declares, "This is a choice vessel unto me." Acts 9:15. This reveals something powerful. God doesn't just change fate, it transforms the mind that sustains that destiny. Because as long as the mind does not change, the person continues to see everything in the same way. He may even try to act differently, but his vision remains limited. And that's why many can't move forward, because they are still looking at life with an old mentality. But when God transforms the mind, he changes everything. Values that once seemed important lose strength. Priorities are reorganized. Things that were previously ignored now have meaning. The vision broadens. If anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. 2 Corinthians 5:17. New creature is not just someone who acts different. He is someone who sees differently. And maybe that's the point that's starting to happen to you right now. Some things that used to make sense no longer do. Certain thoughts begin to be questioned. Certain attitudes no longer seem right as before. This is not confusion. It is transformation. It is God adjusting your way of thinking, aligning your mind with a new spiritual reality. And the more you allow this process, the more your perception changes. What once affected you deeply begins to lose strength. What previously went unnoticed begins to gain importance. Your mind begins to operate on another level. And that impacts everything. Your decisions, your emotions, your way of reacting, your way of living. Because when the mind changes, everything changes. Maybe you still can't fully explain what's going on inside you, but you already feel that something is not the same as before. And that's just the beginning. If there's something in your heart right now that needs intervention, something you feel God is touching as you listen to those words, write that in the comments as a prayer request. It can be simple, it can be direct, but make it a step of faith. Because when you put it before God, something starts to move. There is a type of thinking that imprisons without making noise. He doesn't scream, he doesn't appear, obviously, but it is always there. Remembering, accusing, pointing out past mistakes. It's the fault, and when it dominates the mind, it paralyzes, weakens, and prevents any spiritual advancement. Maybe you know this well. Memories that come back, decisions you wish you had made differently, moments that still weigh inside you, and without realizing it, these thoughts begin to define how you see yourself, as if the past had more voice than what God is doing now. Pedro lived this in a profound way. He walked with Jesus, learned, saw miracles, but in a moment of pressure, he denied it 3 times, and it was no small mistake. It was something that, humanly, could carry a permanent weight inside the mind. Imagine what went through his mind after that. The guilt, the shame, the sense of failure. Accusing thoughts, trying to say that he was no longer worthy, that he had lost everything. But then something happens that completely changes this story. Jesus meets Peter again, and instead of accusing, he asks. Instead of condemning, he restores. And then he declares, "Feed my sheep," John 21:17. That's powerful, because it shows that God does not work with continual condemnation. He doesn't bind you to error. He calls you to a new beginning. It doesn't ignore what happened, but it also doesn't allow it to define who you are. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Romans 8:1. None. This means that thoughts of constant accusation do not come from God. They may even seem true, they may even seem justifiable, but they are not God's voice over you. And to control the mind at this level is to learn to reject this accusation. It's recognizing when a thought tries to tie you to the past and choose to align with God's truth. It's understanding that you're not defined by your worst moment, but by the grace that reached you. This does not mean ignoring mistakes, but it does mean not living imprisoned by them. Because a mind stuck in guilt can't move forward. She always comes back, always remembers, always freezes. But a restored mind begins to walk lightly, clearly, freely. And maybe what you need most today is not more effort, but to accept what God has already released upon you, forgiveness, restoration, and a new way. When it becomes real within you, the guilt loses strength. The accusation is silent, and the mind begins to breathe in a way that perhaps you haven't felt in a long time. There is an invisible barrier that prevents many minds from advancing spiritually, even when a person wants to grow. It's not a lack of prayer, it's not a lack of knowledge. It is pride, and it doesn't appear in an obvious way. It often manifests itself as self-sufficiency, as resistance to learning, as difficulty in recognizing that you need direction. Pride makes the mind believe that it already knows enough, that you don't need to listen, you don't need to change, you don't need to submit. And little by little, this closes spiritual doors that only open through humility. The Bible is clear. God resists the haughty ones, but gives grace to the humble. James 4:6. That means it's not just a matter of behavior, it's a question of access. Pride blocks. Humility liberates. Solomon understood this early on in his journey. Before God, he had the opportunity to ask for anything. Power, wealth, victory, everything was within reach. But his choice reveals the level of his mind. Give your servant an understanding heart. 1 Kings 3:9. He did not ask for what many would ask. He recognized that he needed wisdom, that he didn't know everything, that he depended on God to rule well. And that's exactly what defines a humble mind. It's always open to learning. A teachable mind does not close itself off. It does not defend itself all the time. It does not try to prove that it is right. She listens, she observes, she adjusts, and because of that, it grows. Maybe some thoughts that have been holding you back today are not lack of ability, but lack of openness. Inner resistances that prevent you from seeing something new, from accepting a different direction, from allowing God to shape your way of thinking. Because God does not force transformation, He leads. But only those who are willing to learn can follow this process. Controlling the mind is also this: recognizing that you are still under construction, that there are still things to be adjusted, learned, aligned. And that's not weakness, it is maturity. When humility enters, the mind becomes light. You don't have to carry the weight of having all the answers. You don't have to live trying to control everything. She rests in the process of learning from God. And the more you open up, the more God reveals, more clarity comes, more direction is established. If while you were listening to this, something inside you recognized this truth, perhaps it is time to assume it simply but sincerely. Write in the comments, God chose me. Because a mind that stands in humility begins to live exactly what it was called to. There is a type of mental conflict that is not born from the lack of response, but the resistance to obey what God has already shown. And this is more common than it seems. The mind becomes restless, confused, overloaded, not because God is silent, but because there has already been a direction that has not been followed. Jonas lived exactly that. God gave a clear command. There was no doubt, there was no confusion. But instead of obeying, Jonas decides to run away. Jonah arose to flee from the presence of the Lord. Jonah 1:3. And from that moment on, everything begins to fall into disarray. Notice this, the chaos didn't start around, it started inside. When you know what God wants but choose another path, the mind loses alignment. A weight arises that is difficult to explain. A constant restlessness, a feeling that something is not right, even when apparently everything continues normally. And then come the storms. In Jonah's case, the storm was literal. But often, in real life, it happens inside the mind. Confused thoughts, difficult decisions, unstable emotions, and the person tries to solve it in various ways, but it ignores the root. Disobedience always breeds internal disorder, not because God wants to punish, but because the mind was created to function in alignment with Him. When this alignment is broken, everything starts to fall out of place. And here's a point that changes everything. Obeying is not loss. It is protection. Behold, to obey is better than to sacrifice. 1 Samuel 15:22. Often people try to compensate for disobedience with effort, with attempts, with alternatives, but nothing replaces the power to simply obey. Because when you align with God, the mind finds peace. Even if the path is not easy, even if there are challenges, there is an inner clarity, a quiet security that sustains you. Jonas only found peace when he decided to return, when he stopped running away and repositioned himself. And maybe that's the key you've been missing. No more answers, no more attempts, but a simple step of obedience. It may be something you already know, something that God has already spoken to your heart, something that you have been postponing, avoiding, questioning. But as long as this is not aligned, the mind remains in conflict. And when you decide to obey, something immediate happens. The confusion subsides. The weight comes off. The direction returns, because the mind finds rest when it is in the right place. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, trying to understand, trying to solve, trying to find peace. But what if the answer has already been given, and the next step is just to obey? Stay until the end, because there is something even deeper being revealed. Something that can bring definitive clarity to what today seems confusing within you. There is a silent change that can happen within the mind, capable of completely transforming the way you see life. And it starts with something that many consider too simple: gratitude. Because the mind, when it is not directed, tends to focus on what is missing, on what has gone wrong, on what has not yet happened. He easily clings to the negative, repeats frustrations, magnifies problems. And without realizing it, the person begins to live trapped in a mental pattern that drains peace and steals hope. But gratitude breaks this cycle. She does not ignore reality. It redefines the focus. Jesus showed this clearly when he healed 10 lepers. Everyone received the miracle. Everyone was touched, but only one returned. One of them, seeing that he was healthy, returned glorifying God. Luke 17-15. What made this man come back? He noticed. He acknowledged. He didn't move forward as if it was something ordinary. He stopped and thanked them. And this reveals something profound. Gratitude is not just a reaction. It is a conscious decision of the mind, because the other 9 were also healed, but they did not return. This shows that it is possible to receive blessings and yet maintain a distracted, dissatisfied, disconnected mind. Gratitude repositions the mind. It makes you see what has already been done, instead of just living waiting for what has not yet happened. It brings awareness. It brings presence. It brings balance. In everything give thanks, 1 Thessalonians 5:18. It's not for everything. It's in everything. This means that regardless of the moment, there is something that can be recognized, something that can be valued. And when you practice that, something starts to change internally. Negative thoughts lose strength. The comparison decreases. Anxiety slows down because the mind begins to be reprogrammed. You may not realize it right away, but little by little, your way of thinking changes. You start to see details that you previously ignored. Small blessings that previously went unnoticed, moments that previously had no value, now have meaning. And that connects you with God in a different way, more sensitive, more aware, more present. Gratitude doesn't just change how you feel, it changes what you see, and what you see begins to influence everything you live. If this message reached you, it was not by chance. There is something being adjusted within you now. And if you want to continue receiving this kind of direction that strengthens your mind and faith, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This can keep you connected with what God still wants to reveal. There is something that can compromise the entire construction of your mind without you realizing it right away. The lack of vigilance. Because it's not enough just to learn. It's not enough just to receive direction. It is necessary to protect what is already being built. The mind is constantly influenced by the voices around, by the information that comes in, by the conversations, by the images, by the opinions. And when there is no vigilance, these influences begin to creep in subtly, altering thoughts, weakening convictions, and creating distractions. Nehemiah faced this directly. As he rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, there were constant attempts to distract him. Invitations, proposals, messages that seemed harmless, but that had a clear objective to take him out of focus. And his answer reveals a firm mindset. I am doing a great work so that I cannot come down. Nehemiah 6:3. This is surveillance. He knew what he was doing. He knew the value of that. And so he did not allow any influence to take him out of place. And this is one of the most important points in mind control. Not everything deserves your attention. Because every time you give attention to what you don't edify, something inside you is affected. It may seem small, it may seem irrelevant, but little by little, this shapes thoughts, weakens their clarity, and diverts their focus. The Bible directly warns, be sober. Watch, 1 Peter 5:8. To watch is to be attentive. It's noticing what's going into your mind. It is to identify when something begins to take you away from peace, truth, and God's direction. Maybe today you're dealing with confusing thoughts, constant distractions, difficulty staying focused. And the root may not just be inside, but also what you have allowed yourself to enter. Controlling the mind is also filtering influences. It's choosing what you listen to, what you watch, who you connect with. It is recognizing that your mind is a spiritual environment that needs to be protected, because what comes in remains, and what remains begins to bear fruit. Nehemiah didn't just start well, he protected the process until the end. And that's what sustains a strong mind. It's not just the beginning, it is constant vigilance. Maybe it's time to evaluate what has been taking up space inside you. What has stolen your attention? What has influenced your thoughts? What has taken you away from focus? And when you realize this, do what Nehemiah did. Stay in the right place. Without going down, without giving in, without allowing distractions to interrupt what God is building within you. There is a level of transformation that does not happen by effort nor by repetition, but for exposure. This is when the mind begins to change simply because it is too close to God's presence to remain the same. Moses lived this in a visible way. He went up the mountain to be with God. It wasn't a quick date, it wasn't something superficial. It was intimacy, time, presence, surrender, and something began to happen that went beyond words, beyond teachings. His own appearance began to reflect what he was experiencing. The skin of his face shone. Exodus 34:29. This was not something Moses was trying to do. It was a consequence. It was the result of being exposed to God's glory continuously. And that reveals a deep principle about the mind. That which you contemplate, you begin to reflect. If the mind is constantly exposed to fear, it becomes insecure. If it is exposed to negativity, it becomes heavy. But when it is exposed to the presence of God, it begins to transform. No forced effort, no pressure, no human attempt. They looked at him and were enlightened. Psalm 34:5. This means that there is a light that comes from God and reaches the mind. A clarity that does not come from logic but from presence. A peace that does not depend on circumstances but on connection. And perhaps what you need most today is not more answers, nor more attempts to control everything, but more time in presence, because it is in this place that the mind naturally reorganizes itself. Thoughts begin to align, emotions calm down, decisions become clearer, and the most interesting thing is that this transformation, many times, you don't even notice at the time, but those around him notice. Reactions change, the words change, the way of dealing with situations changes. Because God's presence doesn't just touch you, it marks you. Moses would come down from the mountain differently, but he was not always immediately aware of it. And so it also happens. You begin to change from the inside out, silently, but really. And the more you expose yourself, the more it intensifies. It's not something isolated, it is continuous. It is a relationship that shapes your mind, adjusts your way of thinking, strengthens your spiritual life. Maybe you're trying to change by force, trying to control thoughts, trying to find quick fixes, when in fact the path is deeper and simpler. To remain. Remain in the presence until your mind begins to reflect what you are living with God. Few people will understand this deeply, but if this message has reached you, there is a reason. Continue to the end, because there is still something deeper being revealed, something that can transform the way you think and connect with God once and for all. There is something that most people underestimate, but that exerts a direct power over the mind every day. What comes out of your own mouth, because words are not just sounds. They shape thoughts, influence emotions, and build internal realities. You may never have stopped to notice, but many of the things you feel today began with what you repeated yesterday. Phrases that seem harmless, comments made without thinking, negative statements that are said naturally. And little by little, the mind begins to believe. The Bible reveals this directly. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Proverbs 18:21. This means that what you say doesn't just express what you think, it also feeds into what you'll keep thinking. The people of Israel lived this clearly in the desert. They had been delivered, they were being guided, they were seeing miracles. But even so, they began to murmur. constant complaints, words of doubt, declarations of fear. And that didn't just stay in the environment, entered their minds. They began to believe what they were saying, and then comes a phrase that reveals the impact of this. As you have spoken in my ears, so will I do to you. Numbers 14:28. This shows that words have created a reality, not because God wanted to limit, but because their minds were already shaped by what they repeated. And this continues to happen today, when you constantly declare that you can't, that it won't work, that it's too difficult. Your mind starts to align with that. It loses strength, it loses vision, it loses hope. But the opposite is also true. When you start declaring truth, even if you don't see it all happening yet, something inside you starts to change. The mind is strengthened, faith grows, the perspective broadens. Mind control also involves controlling what you say. It is not a matter of repeating empty phrases, but to align his words with what God says, to replace murmuring with faith, to exchange complaints for conscience, to choose words that edify, not destroy, because every word is a seed, and sooner or later, what you sow grows inside you. Maybe today you need to pay attention not only to what you think, but in what he has declared daily, because your words may be strengthening your mind or weakening it without you realizing it. And when you adjust that, something starts to line up from the inside out. The mind becomes firmer, more aware, more connected with the truth, and what you say starts to build, instead of destroy, the internal environment where it all begins. There is a level of stability that does not depend on what is happening around you, but of what is firm within. And this is rare, because most people can only keep their minds at peace when everything is fine. When things get out of control, the mind follows, destabilizes, agitates, gets lost. But there is a different way of living. Habakkuk reveals this in a way that confronts any human logic. He looks around and everything is missing. There is no harvest, there is no fruit, there are no positive signs. The scenario is one of scarcity, uncertainty, absence, and yet he declares, though the fig tree neither bud, nor be fruit in the vine, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. Habakkuk 3:17-18. This is not denial of reality. This is mind positioning. He does not ignore the chaos. He doesn't pretend everything is fine, but he chooses where his mind will settle, regardless of what's going on outside. And that's exactly what defines a spiritually mature mind, because while the mind depends on circumstances to remain stable, it will always be vulnerable. Any news, any change, any problem, everything has the power to shake. But when the mind is grounded in God, something changes profoundly. She finds a fixed point that does not change, even when everything around her changes. He will not fear evil rumors. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. Psalm 112:7. Notice this. It's not that rumors don't exist. It's just that they don't dominate. Perhaps today you are surrounded by situations that seem uncertain, news that brings concern, scenarios that generate doubt, moments that test your faith. And the natural tendency of the mind is to react, to anticipate, to try to control. But there is another way. It is choosing to trust before understanding. It's deciding to stand firm before you see results. It is to keep the mind on God, even when everything seems unstable. And this does not happen overnight. It is built. It is developed. It is strengthened over time through everything you have learned so far. Every principle, every adjustment, every alignment. All of this is forming a foundation within you. And that foundation is what sustains your mind when chaos strikes, because chaos may even be all around. But it doesn't have to be inside. And when you reach that level, something powerful happens. You stop reacting to the environment and begins to influence the environment with his faith. If this message has confirmed something within you, it may be time to declare it consciously. Write in the comments, "I trust in God's action," because a mind that states this truthfully begins to live with a stability that no longer depends on circumstances. There are times in life when the mind is put in front of decisions that seem too big, paths that require courage, choices that carry weight, directions that do not allow you to go back, and it is in these moments that many get lost, not for lack of option, but for lack of clear direction. The pressure begins to act. The fear of making mistakes grows. The mind tries to predict everything, calculate everything, guarantee everything, but the more you try, the more confused you get. Joshua faced just that. After Moses, one of the greatest leaders in history, the responsibility was now upon him. It wasn't just leading, it was to lead an entire people towards something that was not yet fully visible. It was a constant decision, a continuous burden. And in view of this, God did not give complex strategies. He gave a simple but profound principle: let not the book of this law depart from your mouth, but meditate on it day and night. Joshua 1:8. This reveals something essential. A mind firm in the word is not lost, even under pressure. Because when you know who you're trusting, the decision stops being an unbearable burden and becomes a guided step. It doesn't mean it will be easy, but it does mean that there will be direction. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Proverbs 3:5-6. This is the point that many have difficulty with. Because trusting God requires relinquishing total control. It requires accepting that you won't have all the answers before deciding. It requires walking, many times, on the basis of faith and not on visible certainty. But this is exactly what brings peace. Because when the decision is born of trust in God, the mind is not stuck in the what if. She doesn't wear herself out trying to go back all the time. There is an inner security, even when the path is still being revealed. Maybe you're right in that place right now, faced with a choice, an important decision, something that can change a lot. And your mind is trying to find a reassurance that may never come. But there is something bigger available: direction. And this direction does not come only from analyzing all possibilities. It comes from aligning your mind with God. It comes from abiding in the Word, from seeking, from listening, from trusting. Because when God guides, even difficult decisions carry peace, even if the path is challenging, even if it requires courage, even if it doesn't make sense to everyone around. The mind that learns to trust is not paralyzed. It moves forward safely, and each decision guided by God strengthens this trust even more, creating a cycle where the mind becomes firmer, clearer, and more aligned with what really matters. There is a type of pain that cannot be ignored. It does not disappear over time. It is not resolved with distractions. It is not easily silenced. It is deep pain, the one that reaches the soul and tries to dominate the mind, filling everything with sadness, questioning, and silence. And when that pain comes, the mind starts to fight differently. It's no longer about anxiety or distraction. It's about meaning, about understanding why certain things happened, why losses came, why situations got completely out of control. Job knew this place. In a short time, he lost everything: assets, children, stability. A pain that cannot be easily explained, that cannot be rationalized in a simple way. And yet in the face of all this, he declares something that reveals the level of his mind. The Lord gave, and the Lord took him. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job 1:21. That doesn't mean he didn't feel pain. He felt it. He cried. He questioned it. But his mind did not disconnect from God's sovereignty. And here's where the secret lies. Pain can hit you, but you don't have to dominate your mind. Because when the mind loses this connection with God, it sinks into unanswered questions, repetitive thoughts, a weight that seems to have no end. But when she stays connected, Even without understanding everything, something different happens. There is consolation. The Bible reveals this clearly. The God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our affliction. 2 Corinthians 1:3-4. God does not ignore pain. He enters it. He maintains. It strengthens. It brings a peace that does not immediately eliminate suffering, but prevents it from destroying from within. Maybe you're going through something like that right now. A loss, a silent pain, something that no one sees completely, but that you feel every day. And your mind has been trying to deal with it, trying to understand, trying to endure. But there is a place where you can rest, even in the midst of pain. It's not in the explanation. It is in the presence of God. Job didn't have all the answers, but he had one certainty: God was still God. And that was enough to sustain his mind in the midst of chaos. And maybe that's what you need right now. Not understanding everything, but lean on the one who is above all. Because when the mind finds that place, the pain doesn't disappear immediately, but it loses the power to dominate. And little by little, something begins to be born in the midst of the pain: strength, endurance, and a peace that cannot be explained but can be felt deep within you. There is a way for God to speak that many ignore. Not because he is not communicating, but because the mind is not sensitive enough to perceive. They are not always direct answers. They are not always audible words. Often, they are signs, subtle directions, confirmations that appear on the way, details that seem small, but they carry something profound. The problem is that a distracted mind doesn't recognize these signs, and an overly anxious mind can even see, but it turns everything into doubt. Gideon lived through this process. When God called him, the first reaction was not immediate confidence. It was insecurity. He saw himself as small, incapable, unlikely. But even so, God declared something that completely changed the way he should see himself. "The Lord is with you, you valiant man." Judges 6:12. Notice this. God did not speak based on what Gideon felt. He spoke based on what he already saw. But Gideon's mind still needed to be aligned. And then an interesting process begins. Gideon asks for signs. He seeks confirmation, and God, in his patience, answers. Not with irritation, not with rejection, but leading Gideon step by step, strengthening his confidence. This reveals something important. God understands the process of the mind. He knows that you often need confirmations to move forward, but there is a balance that needs to be learned. Because a spiritual mind discerns signs, but she does not live trapped in constant doubt. There is a difference between seeking direction and living paralyzed, waiting for absolute certainty. "I will instruct you and teach you the way you should go." Psalm 32:8. This shows that God guides. It doesn't leave you lost, but this direction requires attention, sensitivity, a heart willing to understand. Perhaps God has already spoken to you in ways you didn't realize. Small directions, doors that have opened or closed, peace in some decisions, and restlessness in others. But the mind, when it is accelerated or distracted, ignores these details. Controlling the mind is also learning to observe, slowing down, to perceive what is happening around you with a spiritual eye. And little by little you start to recognize patterns, to understand how God speaks to you, to discern when it is direction and when it's just noise. This brings security, not an absolute certainty at all, but a growing confidence that you are not alone, that you are being guided. And the more you develop this sensitivity, the less you depend on external signals, and the more you recognize the inner voice of God. In the next few moments, something even deeper begins to unfold. Pay attention, because what comes next may be just the sign you needed to understand what God is already trying to show you. There is a level of faith that does not depend on what God is going to do, but of who God is. And when the mind comes to that place, it becomes unshaken, not because the circumstances are favorable, but because the internal conviction is stronger than any external scenario. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lived this in an extreme way. Before them was a decision that involved life or death, or bowed before the statue, or they would face the furnace. There was no middle ground. There was no negotiation. It was a time when any natural mind would look for a way out, a justification, a way to escape. But their response reveals something rare. Our God, whom we serve, can deliver us, and if not, know that we will not serve your gods. Daniel 3:17-18. This is faith on a level that goes beyond the outcome. They weren't just relying on deliverance, they were trusting in God. And that changes everything, because most people just keep their mind steady while believing that everything will work out the way they expect. But when there is deep faith, the mind remains steadfast, even when there is no guarantee of the desired outcome. This is spiritual maturity. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope, for he who promised is faithful. Hebrews 10:23. Notice this. Firmness does not come from the absence of pressure. It comes from the conviction of who God is. Maybe today you are facing something that seems impossible. A situation that challenges your faith, that presses your mind, that tries to make you doubt. And the silent question arises, what if it doesn't happen as I expect? It is exactly at this point that faith is revealed, because a mind surrendered to God does not trade its trust based on results. It remains. She maintains. She takes a stand. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not know what would happen inside the furnace, but they knew who they were trusting. And that was enough to keep their minds steady, without fear, without retreating. And when the mind arrives at that place, something powerful happens. Fear loses strength, the pressure decreases, and a different peace begins to exist, even in extreme scenarios, because faith is no longer an expectation, and it becomes a certainty that does not depend on what will happen, but of those who are in control of everything. And that's the key to a truly unshakable mind. There is a force that many ignore in the process of transforming the mind: communion. Because as much as the spiritual walk is personal, it was never meant to be solitary. And when the person isolates himself, something inside begins to weaken without him realizing it. The mind, when it is alone for a long time, tends to amplify negative thoughts, distort perceptions, and create conclusions that are not always true. Without reference, without exchange, without alignment, it begins to revolve around itself. But when there is communion, something changes. The early church lived this intensely, and enduring with one accord always. Acts 2:46-47. It wasn't just an occasional encounter, it was constancy, it was unity, it was presence in each other's lives. And the result of this was growth. Not only spiritual, but also emotional and mental. Because when you are in communion, your mind is strengthened. You hear other perspectives, you receive encouragement, you are reminded of the truth when you begin to forget. There is an exchange that edifies, that corrects, that sustains. Not leaving our congregation, Hebrews 10:25. This is not just advice, it is a protection. Perhaps you have already noticed how certain thoughts intensify when you move away, when you close yourself off, when you decide to deal with everything alone. Small things become big, doubts increase, motivation decreases. But when you connect with people who share the same faith, something aligns. The mind finds balance. Hope is renewed, the force returns. Because God doesn't just use individual moments, it also uses people. Communion brings light to areas that you would not see on your own. It breaks internal cycles, brings clarity, strengthens decisions. And often, a simple conversation can completely change the course of a thought that was taking you to the wrong place. This does not mean depending on people, but it means recognizing that God also acts through them. Mind control also involves choosing who you walk with, who you listen to, who you allow to have access to your thoughts, who influences you. Because a mind surrounded by faith is strengthened. But an isolated mind becomes more vulnerable, and maybe that's an important adjustment point now, not just looking inside, but also to the side. Recognize that there are connections that need to be strengthened, environments that need to be sought, relationships that can contribute to your journey. Because when the mind connects with the body, it finds support. And this support makes all the difference in the continuous process of transformation. There is a moment when the transformation is no longer just internal and begins to become visible. Because when God changes someone's mind, it is not hidden. It appears in attitudes, in words, in the way of living. It becomes a living testimony. The Gadarene demoniac was someone completely dominated. His mind was in total chaos. He lived isolated, imprisoned, without control, without peace. No one could help him. No one could contain him. It was the portrait of a totally imprisoned mind. But when Jesus enters the story, everything changes. The liberation was not only physical, it was mental, spiritual, complete. That man who was once dominated was now in full control. The mind that was chaos was now clarity. The life that was destruction was now purpose. And then Jesus says something that reveals the next step. Go to your house, to yours, and tell them how great things the Lord has done for you. Mark 5:19. Notice this, the transformation does not end in liberation. It continues in the testimony. Because a naturally transformed mind begins to impact others. You don't need to force, you don't need to convince, it simply reflects what happened. Let your light so shine before men. Matthew 5:16. This means that the inner change becomes an outer light. People notice. They see something different, something they can't fully explain, but that catches their attention. You may not realize how much has changed. Small adjustments in the way of thinking, different reactions, more aligned decisions. Things that seem simple, but that show that something is happening inside you. And that's not just for you. God transforms your mind so that your life becomes living proof of what He can do. Someone can look to you and find hope. You can listen to your story and realize that it is also possible to change. The Gadarene did not return to the same place as an ordinary person. He came back as someone transformed. And this transformation spoke louder than any words. And that's exactly what starts to happen when your mind is aligned with God. Your life begins to communicate something. Your presence carries something. Their attitudes reveal something effortlessly. No appearance, only result. Maybe you're still in the process. But there are already signs of this transformation, and the longer you keep going, the more it becomes evident, because what God does within inevitably appears outside, and this opens doors, touches lives, changes environments. At the end of this path, there is something even deeper being prepared for you. Keep going, because what is to come can take you to a level of understanding and experience with God that goes beyond anything you have lived so far. There is something dangerous that many do not realize: spiritual postponement. The idea that there is time, that then you change, then you align, then you take more seriously what God has already shown. And meanwhile, the mind is still in the same place, stuck in the same patterns, in the same doubts, in the same resistances. But there is one detail that changes everything. God's time does not work like ours. The Bible clearly states, "Behold, now is the acceptable time." 2 Corinthians 6:2. Now, not tomorrow, not when everything is resolved, not when you feel ready. It's now. Because every time you postpone a decision that God has already placed in your heart, something inside you becomes more resistant. The mind begins to get used to disobedience, to spiritual procrastination, to the idea that it can always leave it for later, and this weakens. Noah lived in a time completely opposite to what God was asking for. While everyone around lived in unbelief, distracted, ignoring any spiritual direction, Noah received clear instruction. And the most powerful was not only what he heard, that's what he did. Thus did Noah, according to all that God commanded him. Genesis 6:22. No delay, no negotiation, without adaptation to the opinion of others. This reveals an aligned mind, a mind that not only understands, but he answers. Perhaps you have already received directions from God. Adjustments that need to be made, decisions that need to be made, paths that need to be left. But something always tries to postpone. A justification, a doubt, a fear. And in the meantime, the transformation is at a standstill. But there is a point where this needs to change, where you realize that continuing to postpone is too expensive. It costs your peace, your clarity, your spiritual evolution. Because the mind that responds immediately to God's call is strengthened. It becomes more sensitive, firmer, more aligned. But the mind that postpones, it becomes more confused, heavier, more distant, and maybe this is exactly the moment that defines something important in your life. It's not about understanding everything. It's about responding, because God is not asking for perfection, is asking for a position. And when you decide to take action, even if you don't have all the answers, something starts to move. The mind aligns, the path opens, the direction becomes clearer. Nothing in this life happens by chance. If that word has come to you now, there is a purpose in it. And if something inside you recognizes this, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Because a mind that responds to God's timing begins to live what once seemed distant. Everything that has been revealed so far points to a decisive moment. It is not enough to understand. It is necessary to deliver. Because the mind only finds true rest when it stops resisting and begins to surrender completely to God. Perhaps you have recognized areas that need to change, thoughts that need to be aligned, decisions that can no longer be postponed. And now, more than reflecting, it is time to put this before God. It is in this place of surrender that what seemed difficult begins to be transformed from the inside out. The Word guides us in this moment with depth. "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my thoughts." Psalm 139:23. This is more than a prayer. It is a total surrender. It is allowing God to enter the deepest places of the mind and begin to rearrange everything. And there is a promise for those who choose to wait and trust. Good is the Lord to those who wait for him. Lamentations 3:25. Now, silence from within. Let go of everything that distracts you, everything that weighs you down, everything that you try to control. This is the time to open your heart and put your mind before God, trusting that he is ready to act, restore, and bring peace where there was once conflict. Beloved Father, your word reminds us that there is a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that guards the mind and heart, even when everything seems confusing. And it is before this promise that we place ourselves now with open hearts and surrendered minds. Lord, we thank you for all that has been revealed so far, for every teaching, for every direction, for every adjustment that you have begun to make within us. Thank you that the Lord does not leave us lost within our own thoughts, but leads us with truth, with light, and with love. Thank you that even when the mind was tired, overwhelmed, or confused, the Lord remained there, working in silence, restoring that which no one else could touch. Now, God, we ask you for strength and wisdom. It teaches us to live everything we learn, Give us discernment to identify thoughts that do not come from you, courage to reject that which weakens us, and faith to stand firm in your truth. Strengthen our minds so that they do not lean into fear, doubt, or anxiety, but remain aligned with your voice. Father, we place before you every area of our life. Those who are facing emotional battles brings peace. Those who are anxious soothes the heart. Those who are sick release healing. Those who are going through financial difficulties open doors and bring provision. It restores families, strengthens relationships, brings direction to difficult decisions, and lifts up those who are already without the strength to continue. At this moment, in silence, each one presents before you that which no one else sees, that which is kept in the depths of the soul. Lord, we commend everything into your hands. Every thought, every worry, every fear, every doubt. We no longer want to carry that which does not come from you. We renounce all anxiety, all confusion, all lies that have tried to dominate our minds, and we declare that our mind belongs to the Lord. Create in us, O God, a pure heart, and renew within us a firm, clean mind, aligned with your will. May your presence pervade every inner space, bringing clarity where there was confusion, bringing light where there was darkness, bringing peace where there was war. And may the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, now guard our minds and hearts in Christ Jesus. We trust, we deliver, we rest. In Jesus' name, amen. After everything you've heard so far, one truth needs to be engraved within you. Your mind is not a lost place. It's a territory that can be governed. God has never left you without direction. Every teaching, every passage, every example we have seen reveals that there is a clear path to living with peace, clarity, and inner mastery. This message is for you. It was not by chance that you got here. God chose you to hear this today because He knows exactly what has been going on inside your mind. And now the question that remains is simple but profound. What are you going to do with all this from today on? I am very happy to know that we are together on this journey. Really, this is not just a video, it is a spiritual journey that we are living side by side, and you are part of it. So I want to ask you something with affection. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell if you haven't done it yet. But more than that, I want to hear from you. Comment below where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share what you have been experiencing. We want to read, pray, and walk together with you. Your story matters, your life has value, and God is looking at you now. And it doesn't stop here. What you have received today is just a part of something much bigger that God wants to build in your life. In the next video, we'll delve even deeper into this path, revealing how to live daily in God's presence and keep your mind aligned even in the midst of life's challenges. There is a next step waiting for you, and it can completely change the way you live your faith. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart. Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater than any attack. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and I'll wait for you in the next video.